Okay, welcome everyone to our event today. My name is Irina Marinov, and I'll be your host. I'm a faculty in Earth and Environmental Science department, and I am here with some of the students from my global climate change class, and we are very excited to have Anne Berg visit us today. Anne Berg was born and raised in Germany, and she came to the US to go to Rutgers University, where she double majored in history and psychology. And then she completed a PhD in modern German and European history at the University of Michigan. Anne studies the histories of waste and recycling, and is a specialist on Nazi Germany, and is working on a book looking at the connections between waste management and genocide. She teaches a variety of interesting classes at the intersection of world history and environmental history and history of garbage, which is quite fascinating, and teaches this semester at Penn a class on white nationalism in the age of climate change. And I wanted very much to have her here to talk to those of us who are not lucky enough to have the time to take or be in her class this semester, to give us a little bit of a preview of what her class is about and what she studies. I'm hoping that will open up our minds and get us excited, and so we can do some readings on our own after this. And so we're super excited to have you here. We're starting with all the videos, with all the pictures off, but I will invite you after a little while, if you want and you're comfortable, to come in with your video, so that after the first 20 minutes or so, this becomes more of a discussion, and anybody can ask questions and so forth. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Irina. I'm excited to be here. This is really great because it forced me to also more clearly articulate what the class is about, because it's a seminar. So the students sort of have the chance to figure out those connections between, climate change and white nationalism themselves. And so now I'm going to try to articulate that a little bit for those of you here. Thank you really very much for this wonderful introduction. And if there are questions about some of the things I'm talking about or the work that I do, I'm happy to answer those as well. I should start with a little warning, perhaps. In the eyes of the Constitution Day panel of experts on American history that met last week, I'm one of those dangerous academics who is about to indoctrinate you. And I paraphrase, with theory and hateful ideology that insists on the reality of systemic racism in American society. So if this is not for you, then, yeah, that's what's coming. So I'm just going to warn you, not because I believe in a marketplace of ideas, but because I want to be upfront about how political this is and how invested I am in the politics of this topic. So I'm going to share my screen, perhaps, and start with an image that, hold on, that I would, a juxtaposition of images, actually, that I would like to invite you to consider. Juxtaposing them now maybe not as jarring or as puzzling as it was when I first proposed to teach this class. So my department was at first sort of telling me, but don't assume that this connection is real. Why don't you phrase the class as pondering whether there is a connection between climate change and the rise of white nationalism, which to me at the time seemed crystal clear, that the connection is undeniably there. But I think it's a good practice always to question one's assumption, be they scholarly or not, be they implicit or not. And so what I'm going to try to do is to explain in the time that I have here why I think this connection is real, and try to do so both historically and in the present. So yes, it is true that eco-fascism is not really the dominant mode in which this connection expresses itself in the US. Eco-fascism, at least for now, is really more prominent in Europe, even though we see some shifting in this regard, particularly now after this summer. But the simple reason for this is that in Europe, the far right, Europe in general, but even the far right, is not as hostile to science and evidence-based analysis as is the case in the US. In the US, climate change denial and right-wing populism seem to be kind of going hand in hand. And so my assertion about the connection between climate change and the rise of white nationalism perhaps really does need to be explained in the US context. And I should also say I'm not a US historian. My main area of expertise is modern Germany, as Irina had mentioned. And so my analysis here is really informed by the teaching that and reading that I have done on world history, of which obviously US history is an important part. But hence my arguments are really kind of coming from a different perspective. Okay, so before I get into this, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a little bit, and I can leave it on there, it may be easier. But I want to define a few terms first. Okay, so I'm drawing a distinction here between white supremacy and white nationalism. I think it's an important one. White supremacy is the system in which we live. It's a system in which white identity is unmarked, meaning that being white is implied to be the norm for humanity. It's a system in which non-white individuals constantly have to defend and assert their status as persons. And it's a system not of hatred necessarily, but of systemic oppression, exploitation, and exclusion that shrouds itself in a set of universals, best captured by the phrase, all people are equal before the law, that hides its own operations from the white majority. Because this claim, all people are equal in front of the law or before the law, is experienced to be true only by white people. And so this is why most white people are able to go through life without experiencing themselves as living in a white supremacist system. However, this system is centuries old and built on slavery and systematic oppression, labor and resource extraction from people of color, built on structures that reshaped themselves in a post-slavery, post-Jim Crow, post-civil rights world, so much so that white people continuously deny its existence and insist rather that inequalities that they very much see are the result of personal flaws, bad decisions, or bad luck, rather than structurally defined and systemic. So the mechanisms that are perhaps most significant in reproducing white supremacy in the Western world, and the US is not alone here, is the carceral system. So, police, prisons, the judiciary at large, and the profit-making industries that are connected to the carceral system and draw a huge profit from them. Housing discrimination, and schooling and education. And so if there are questions about this, I mean, obviously I don't have time to expand too much. I'd be happy to field that in the Q&A. White nationalism, on the other hand, is the self-described or self-professed ideology of a number of right-wing groups that can collectively be grouped perhaps by another self-descriptor, the alt-right. Okay, so it's an alternative conservatism that these groupings are articulating. These are identitarian, male chauvinist, Western chauvinist, ultra-nationalist, anti-feminist, transphobic, and often violently racist groups that insist that white genocide is occurring currently, that Western civilization is in decline and besieged, that traditional gender norms and family values have come under attack. And in order to return to an imagined glorious past in which everybody had a place and everybody knew what's what, they propose to establish a white ethno-state. White nationalists insist, however, that they are not white supremacists or racists, even, or at least some of those groups. There are some that are explicitly racist and even white supremacists, but most white nationalists claim that they are race neutral or race realists, meaning that they don't view one race to be better than another, but rather believe in the danger of race mixing. Viewing race primarily in cultural terms rather than biological terms, there's a lot of inconsistency here, though. So there's a slippage between, you know, definitions of race in biological and cultural terms. That's often evident in the rhetoric. But nonetheless, white nationalists generally assert that they are against race mixing, that each race will be healthier and better off and more prosperous if kept separate. And so their claim to creating white enclaves or white ethnostates is simultaneously proposing to protect white people and all other races. And so they consider that what's happening right now with, you know, the multi-ethnic plurality that I very much welcome, that this is presenting a genocide against white people. And in order to preserve their heritage and their culture, Western civilization in general, they need to wall themselves off, produce white enclaves, ethnostates, prevent race mixing in order to not be bred out, diluted, and erased. And so building walls, removing by peaceful or not so peaceful ethnic cleansing, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQIA individuals, and in some cases Jews, are from the body politics are some of their proposed strategies and professed goals, actually. And so the spectrum of subscribers to white nationalism is constantly growing, and heritage defenders, as you've seen in Philly around Marconi Plaza, QAnon supporters, race realists, fundamentalists, religious conservatives have multiple points of affinity with overtly and expressly white nationalist groups. And all of these groups are invested, whether they say so or not, in maintaining white supremacy, i.e. the status quo of the current system, and defended, if need be, by violence. So how is this connected to climate change? And that really is something that I'm going to try to explain. Perhaps this summer with COVID, the George Floyd rebellions, and the wildfires currently raging in California, this is more apparent, but I'm going to take us back to the 1960s and sort of think about how the 1960s and the decades that followed shaped the grievances that currently undergird white nationalist ideology. And here I want to just briefly explain that it was in the 60s that people of color, Black Americans in particular, asserted their right to personhood and jolted white supremacy to its core, spilling into the streets in ways that became really radicalized in response to the increase in policing and police oppression, in response to both civil rights and anti-war demonstrations in the 1960s. And so the anti-war movement hammered home the point, demonstrating how deeply divided America was. So the parallels to now are quite apparent. But obviously this is part of a much broader geopolitical moment, and part of a realization that the possibility of annihilation endemic to the Cold War scenario is really threatening the globe in many different kinds of ways. And the coalescence of these different movements add feminism into the mix, really kind of get to the core of the grievances that white nationalists claim to experience. And so obviously the colonies declared their independence, the sort of status quo of of the white majority was coming under attack from a number of different groups: young people, Black people, women, and obviously the vast majority of colonized people that upended the world order upon which white supremacy was built. However, this coincided, and I should say, perhaps it didn't coincide, perhaps this is hardly a coincidence, I mean, that is my argument, with the sort of discovery of the planet as a place that has finite resources. And here the biologist, Paul Ehrlich, is really a key figure who, with his 1968 book, Population Bomb, kind of pushed this agenda into the mainstream, arguing that the planet cannot support this many people, that we need to limit population growth or disaster will strike. And he basically advocated population control to avoid what he called the death rate solution, by which the planet would simply explode with too many people, unable to feed them, and masses of people would die. So he advocated for very much Malthusian politics of, systematically trying to limit population growth, whether by adding sterilants to the water supply or sterilizing individuals, and so on and so forth. He was particularly making this argument about the food supply, being quite worried that the planet would be unable to feed its population. And so he basically came to describe the feel of overpopulation on a family trip to India, because obviously Ehrlich wasn't worried about white Americans reproducing too fast, right? That was not his concern. But when he drove in a cab through India, this is what he reported: people eating, people washing, people sleeping, people visiting, arguing, screaming, people thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people hurting animals, people. What he doesn't say is that what he is seeing are brown people. And that is really what sort of sparks his sense of the feel of overpopulation and this dread. And so poor people of color are the kinds of people that inform Ehrlich's theories and kind of are at the center of this book, and moreover inform the policies that he proposes, and his arguments and proposals really resonate with white supremacist practices. And we see in the 1970s the largest increase in forced sterilization of poor African American women, for example, in the United States. And the contemporary assault on women in ICE detention centers is just another reminder of how clearly connected those ideas really are. We should also, however, say that the sort of sense of overpopulation extends itself into the sort of understanding of the dynamics inside the United States, particularly with respect to cities. The sort of feel of individuals in the urban jungle. The ghettos are kind of likened to the fecund hordes that are teeming over the planet in the eyes of law and order proponents in the 1970s, 80s, and to this day. What is more, and I think this is really important, is that the notion of toxicity and pollution that Rachel Carson's Silent Spring brought to the consciousness of white middle-class Americans is really the flip side, produced on the flip side, the sort of images of polluters and unruliness, disorder, toxic dangers that was associated with the urban jungle yet again, and the hell of the ghettos, and juxtaposed to, unadulterated nature and pristine landscapes. And so the thugs that ransacked and looted in response to police violence then and now, ideologically kind of likened to the fecund hordes of the third world that since the 1970s have been driven by what we now recognize as climate-related pressures, migrate. At the same time, the white majority is looting the planet, and those kinds of connections are obviously not easy to stomach, I should say. And in response to that, we see a return to law and order rhetoric and wall building, immigration restrictions that are part of a toolkit that is really just refined and repeated since the 1970s in new forms, but that is much older. What is more, I think, is that we see the grievances in white nationalist movements contemporary linked to plastics in ways that might be even less intuitive. Since the 1970s, also, male sperm count has declined by 50%. And this is due to the product that is sort of the epitome of petrocapitalism, plastics, which is now in our water, in our salt, in everything that we consume, and acts in the body as mimics basically the function of estrogen. And it's very likely that the massive decline in sperm count is due to the consumption and the plastification of everyday life in contemporary Western world and everywhere else, actually. And so obviously this kind of gets us to the grievances of white nationalist individuals. Most of them are men. They feel that their world, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think, at this point, if I can. Somehow, now I can. Which really kind of focuses on a sense of a lost world, a sense of besieged masculinity, of a heritage that has come under attack, massive uncertainty, and the profound insecurity that is experienced in their sense and role as men who are meant to provide for families in the ideal that was, basically the creation of a Victorian society and middle-class society in the 19th century. So those certainties that are projected into the past as having been a given, and the sense of, a rapid decline socioeconomically, and the presence of individuals who are not white and not straight and not bound by the same sort of ideological frame into the public sphere in ways that kind of makes an assertion and produces an assault against white supremacy is really very much connected to the overarching pressures and uncertainties that we see with spill into the streets really this summer with COVID-19, the George Floyd rebellions, and the wildfires, hurricanes, floods that continue to displace people from all over the world, but also inside the United States. And these developments clearly pose a profound threat to the already besieged identity of predominantly white men. I'm going to end here and open it up for questions.
Well, since I have the microphone here, maybe I can ask, can you put for us a little bit in this context what happened last week, meaning the conference at the White House on American history? And I have to say I didn't have time to watch the whole thing, just snippets from here and there. So yeah, but it's very, very extremely hard to stomach. So you can't take too much at a time, right? Maybe small snippets, and preferably if they come from Colbert or some funny, with some jokes to make it more palatable. But yeah, how do you see that conference
in light
um,
of this? I mean, very clearly, the sort of sense of a lost history, right, of a lost heritage that is so central to white nationalist sentiments was basically taken up by this panel of experts. And the history that I write, the history that most of my colleagues write, is the kind of history that that has been identified as a threat to the status quo. And it is. I mean, simply put, it is. That's precisely the project. The project of many academics right now is really to try to poke holes into white supremacy and kind of bringing it back into consciousness, because it has effectively hidden itself from view from the white majority. And part of what I consider to be my job is to bring that back into view. And so obviously this panel is kind of the official version of the statue protectors that come to Marconi Plaza, club swinging, hammer wielding, trying to protect Christopher Columbus, who is now boxed up, but nonetheless there and protected by police and SWAT.
So is the, I guess it's a, yeah, it's, I should let the students ask the questions, but I'm just curious, it's who are the historians that are chosen to be on these kind of panels? And is your field in some sense, right, modern history in general, divided in any sense, or not really, right?
Not really in the spaces that I frequent, no. I mean, I might be perhaps a little more radical than some of my colleagues, but I think in terms of the ways that we understand, you know, a theory and a system and systems, there's a lot of overlap. So there are obviously conservative historians who have a different approach, who sort of believe that history is shaped by individuals, predominantly men, but they don't exclude the possibility of those being women or people of color or what have you. But that is the assumption that surely, you know, your upbringing, your material conditions, your education matters, but ultimately you're the master of your own destiny. And those who haven't, you know, pulled themselves up by the bootstraps of the boots that they don't wear, that they don't have, that they don't own, they're just, you know, just not good enough humans. And so obviously, you know, scholars have a different way of framing this, and the panel of experts would never put this in such crude terms, but rather is sort of saying that people like myself are attacking American institutions, American heritage, besmirching American history. Of course, there were mistakes, but overall, the project of progress, of, you know, democracy and the liberation of the world is ongoing and should not be dragged into the mud by claims about, you know, structural systemic flaws. Rather, they consider people like myself to be the sort of, you know, string pullers who with, I mean, I don't have a degree from an Ivy League institution, but I teach at one, but who with an Ivy League degree in the one hand, and this is a almost direct quote from the panel, and a Molotov cocktail in the other, are egging on the thugs and looters in the streets. So
So it's I mean, so many things come to mind this when you talk, right? One of them is that this is so in line with the, you know, with the text of the Trump administration this year on all the Ivy Leagues, right? There have been all these the recent case at Princeton comes to mind. That's quite interesting and seems very related to your topic right now. I don't know if our students know about that.
Maybe you can just quickly fill them in. I'm not sure that I.
Yeah. No. It's just the president, the Eisengruber of Princeton, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, put a statement about recognizing how Princeton has a history of systemic racism, and that we need to change. We need to to improve. The name of the Woodrow Wilson Policy School was changed this summer and so forth, which is a very big step because it's been there forever. And in response to that, it was just announced that the administration and I guess is it the Department of Justice, I guess in this case, will seek, is now gonna act to check in with Princeton and investigate whether they're real, where these issues are real, and if indeed Princeton is discriminating against. So that's quite interesting, and it's super connected, and it happened, yeah, again and again and again. But one other thing that I immediately saw here is there's a connection with climate science, which I do is which is what I do, is this connection of I don't know if you followed the recent news, but a prominent climate skeptic, his name is Legates, was recently politically appointed to be in a very top position at the National Ocean Atmospheric Administration. And he's contesting the fact that, right, climate change is human-made and so forth. So do you study or think at all about this parallel, which is just occurs to me now for the first time, of basically handpicking, right, among the sea of scientists, right, 1 in a million maybe, finding that one particular scientist, right, who disagrees with the consensus of the majority, handpicking that scientist and putting him in a prominent position that resonates with what the administration believes. And I'm just wondering if we're seeing with what happened last week and this conference, is there a similar handpicking of historians going on? I don't know. Okay, and I'll stop here and we can ask.
Well, I mean, this is the kind of parallels that I should point to when that kind of connect the two classes that I'm teaching this semester. I also teach Origins of Nazism, from democracy to race war and genocide, Germany 1918 to 1945. And so what we are seeing right now, whether, you know, some of the ideologies are clearly different, and while there are a number of other striking differences, there are also some parallels. And I personally would argue that we are witnessing a rapid descent into a fascist, proto-fascist, or authoritarian system right now. And the sort of handpicking of scientists, of, you know, cleansing the universities, are part of some of those strategies, I think, that are kind of like the go-to first steps in any kind of, you know, assertion of, you know, a one-party authoritarian system. So we don't have to look to the Nazis for that. There are multiple examples across the world, but obviously the kind of what is interesting here is that this all happens in the name of free speech, right? That this is something that occurs in the United States as an attempt to defend free speech, First Amendment rights, claiming that the white majority actually has been silenced by people like me, by the uprisings, by Black people, by trans people, by non-straight individuals, non-binary individuals who are asserting their voices in ways that resonate and demand to be heard in very new ways. And I think there we can see the sort of sense of grievance that I've outlined earlier now being kind of taken up by the highest office in the land. And I mean, there is an arsenal of tools that can now be leveraged to, you know, redress these grievances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, so many things to ask, but so can we have some student questions? Can you
if you're more comfortable, you can dump them in the chat too.
Yeah, exactly. That's the other way. If you don't want to ask questions, can we? What are you thinking about? What are you? Yeah.
I have a question about what you said just now in the 20-minute lecture. I was wondering whether, so you mentioned how kind of the plastic in our oceans, and I'm imagining microplastics are getting into, I guess, our bodies, and how it's kind of mimicking estrogen.
Yeah.
How does that connect with white nationalism? Would you mind kind of repeating the connection there? Thank you.
Yeah, so white nationalism really is very much a male chauvinist movement. Okay, so a lot of what we're seeing is this sort of sense that masculinity is under siege, and biologically it is. So there is a reality to that experience that I was kind of trying to point out. It is not just because you know, gender norms are changing, but we're also seeing that and that's kind of what they call a red pill. So the sort of, it goes back to the Matrix. You take the red pill and you see the world for what it is, and otherwise, you can live with your delusions. And that's what white nationalist movements basically say. You need to take the red pill in order to actually see what's going on, because we all of us here, we live in a deluded world. We don't understand what's really going on, so we haven't yet been red pill. I mean, I don't know. I'm assuming that you haven't. But once you've taken the red pill, you will see that that the world is going to shits, and white people are being genocided against by all these groups that I have just listed. And so gender is the most prominent red pill, and it's the way by which white nationalism sort of seeps into the mainstream, because non-binary identities are profoundly threatening. I mean, why do we have a regime that focuses more on wombs and bathrooms than anything else? That is the biggest issue right now in the contemporary public discourse of what the threat is to white identity, and it's profoundly gendered. It doesn't mean that only men subscribe to this type of nonsense. I hope I'm not offending anyone, but I'm so angry these days that my anger sometimes spills into public performance.
I'm actually having the same problem in teaching this semester. I start every day, and I should really not read the news before I start my 10:30 class, because I just can't. It's very hard to focus.
I just want to continue
exactly
the connection between the sort of besieged identity of men and women, who actually many of them would like to be able not to work, to stay home, and kind of have this sort of stable family, like the sort of uncertainty that we experience as a result of the cascading pressures and crises right now. They sort of heighten the sense of wanting to go back to a world in which everything was clear, in which a woman was a woman and a man was a man, and bam. And so even though white nationalists here still deny the reality of climate change, the ways in which the pressures that climate change produces seep into society clearly informs the grievances that they that they articulate, and that shapes their politics. I'm just reading the chat question. About the Silent Spring. I'm just going to read it out loud, okay? I've learned in many previous classes that Silent Spring was a major catalyst to the environmental movement, never in the context of it having white nationalist undertones. Do you think that today's climate movements have more underlying white nationalism than we realize? I think that was the case at the time also. And I'm actually going to talk about this with a panel of former and current activists tomorrow evening, that actually the reason for why Earth Day and the environmental movement was such a big deal is because it gave white middle-class individuals an entry point into activism that was kind of, clean, white, happy, nonviolent, and palatable to the establishment, whereas anti-war and Black Power movements at the time were not palatable to the establishment. And also because of the reaction of police to these movements. I mean, we saw massive crackdowns that, very much resemble the kind of crackdown that we've seen over the summer that is still ongoing in places like Kenosha and Portland and elsewhere. Really spawning the sort of takeoff of the militarization of police that learned from the policing of the third world, the kind of using of counterinsurgency tactics and re-importing them into the US and militarizing police in a way that we now see, you know, SWAT and tanks and LRADs and MRADs and what have you in our own cities. That has its origins in this moment in the 1960s, and to a lot of middle-class whites, the kind of, you know, rioting and looting was very much the same sort of threat that you see now, and environmentalism provided a way to sort of reassert the universal we all humans, but really what they meant was white people. And if you look at the pictures from Earth Day, if you look at environmentalism in the 1970s and 80s, it's almost exclusively white. Environmental justice movements started in the third world and have really transformed environmentalism. But the sort of rhetoric of pollution, the threat to, you know, the status quo, that environmentalism kind of linked to toxins and an imagination of a pristine nature, is something that really kind of provided an alternative mode to be active and do good things when Black power and anti-war activism, you know, was no longer possible without, you know, fighting back. And so I think we are seeing actually right now something that is quite similar, just more pronounced. What we're also seeing right now is that the alliance between these different movements is much stronger. So the rebellions right now are multiracial, multi-generational, in ways that is really quite profound, and I think opens up a lot of possibilities. And the issues also that are recognized are, you know, yes, COVID is a real threat. Yes, climate change is real. Like in this particular moment, these movements actually coincide and coalesce in ways that was not the case in the 1960s and 70s. Okay. Climate change disproportionately affects people of color and those in low-income communities. Yes. So do you think not doing anything about climate change is also a form of white nationalism? Absolutely. I actually make this argument, and if you want to read something, as an article by Jonathan Franzen in the New Yorker, that basically makes this argument, or that's where, you know, where I take this argument from. Its title is "What If We Stop Pretending?" And he suggests that climate change is coming, and there's really no way to escape it. And the sort of clamoring for, you know, a solution that will arrest carbon emission is simply kind of reproducing a form of denial, that it's not that we shouldn't be doing this, it's not that we shouldn't look for global solutions, but he says what we need to do is actually look and face up to the inequalities that are currently already existing in our communities, and think about, you know, mitigating homelessness, doing something about educational inequalities, about racism. These are all related to climate change, because climate change so disproportionately affects and people of color and you know, and people from lower socioeconomic classes, and dramatically exacerbates existing inequalities. And so starting there is actually a mode of action that would allow us to effectively respond. Whereas we do not have, as we clearly not with the current administration, the global executive power to actually implement large-scale solutions to the climate crisis, right? So those structures do not exist and are systematically blocked by some of the world's superpowers. And so the kinds of actions that we can take, Franzen is arguing, are the actions in our communities to mitigate precisely those effects, those disproportionate effects. And if we don't do that, yeah, then I would say that is basically feeding into the mentality that will eventually lead to people walling themselves off, hoarding the resources, and letting the rest of the world die.
A lot of what you're saying is troubling. So I've never studied this, so I had no idea about this history of environmentalism and its connections with yeah, with the white nationalism and so forth. So how about today? Are the climate activists movements separating themselves from that past? And how does one do climate activism in an intersectional way, I guess, in a way that's right? Are there groups out there that do it right and groups that don't do it right? I've never studied this, so I don't know much.
I don't want to be the judge of who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong. Like that really is above my pay grade. But I will say that there are obviously, it's not that clear cut, right? Ever since, and even before the sort of modern environmentalism, we have different sort of trends, right? We think about the species, or we think about communities. And the species level argument basically lends itself to a more eco-fascist or white nationalist approach, right? Where we're willing to sacrifice some, but not all. We're preserving the species. We just are not explicit about whom we're sacrificing, right? And so I keep saying, like, well, you know, climate change, I mean, it's really not a threat to the planet. The planet will be fine. It's a threat to humans, right? It's a threat to us, all of us. Yeah. And so the planet will be better off if we're not there. So that's, you know, in that sense, the planet is totally fine. We don't need to worry about the planet. But we need to worry about humans, and we need to be explicit about what that means. And if we worry about all humans, then clearly we're doing it wrong. Right. And so we see, and I want to respond to Simon's question here a little bit, like it's a sort of movement in Europe is much more explicitly eco-fascist in some sense. There are also, you know, environmental activists who are very much kind of on the environmental justice spectrum. But there are now eco-fascist movements that really kind of imagine like an eco-dictatorship where resources are administered and doled out to the worthy. Oh God, water shortage, yes. Which obviously, you know, I mean, oh God, I mean, yes, I mean, I don't even know where to start. I've been combating the idea of that water shortages are because of overpopulation all my life, and now in my global water classes, but this is the first I realized it is a racist worldview. It has always been an economic power dynamic in terms of access to water. So water and food, and obviously also air, right? I mean, it's the sort of things that we tend to take for granted, but access to all of those things is profoundly racialized in a white supremacist world system. And overpopulation, I mean, it's so interesting because, I mean, there is obviously truth to that, right? I mean, but it's not that it is, but we've got it all wrong. I mean, the real problem are we, people in the global north, who are consuming most of the planet's resources. I mean, the US has 5% of the world's population and consumes more than a quarter of its resources. And so if we are the problem, our population, and it's not really the numbers, it is our lifestyle. So what climate activists and social justice activists who are kind of pulling on the same end of this, you know, this argumentative string, if you will, they're basically now making the argument that it's not population that's the problem, is capitalism. And any meaningful solution to ending both white supremacy and responding in a resilient and meaningful way to the climate emergency requires an end to capitalism. And I mean, there I think you see really in the streets right now, in the response to what's happening in the context of, you know, the dual crisis of the pandemic and the rebellions, is a criminalization of dissent. And it's because at the core of white supremacy is property. Property was the thing that Kant came up with that would basically do away with these old separations of and hierarchies of, you know, you're being born of noble birth and things like that. So property was supposed to be an equalizer, but it was always tied to being white and male. And so the whole system of white supremacy was built on protecting property, and Black people were property. The prison system basically reinvented the plantation. And so we have those kinds of connections, and we're seeing this in the streets right now. What's happening is a crackdown and in defense of property, because what you have is people basically making the argument loud and clear without sort of saying, you know, we want a communist system. They're saying we value people over property. There are more questions. Irina, do you want to do me a favor and field the questions rather?
No, I mean, all of them are amazing. All of them are amazing. So a few of them, one that's interesting, and we missed the hi, Wharton MBA student here. I'm curious about your thoughts on the responsibility of business leaders in confronting the systemic injustices of our time beyond vapid, we care to PR statements. In your history research, are there examples of businesses that have been good citizens? What can we learn from them? I asked this of a professor and they literally told me we'll solve climate change later. That's interesting. Oh no. I thought Wharton was turning a little bit more to the left, but
well, I mean, it's hard, right? I mean, you know, business leaders aren't going to abolish themselves. Police not going to abolish themselves. Like that's the sort of thing that really gets to the core of those contradictions. I mean, we live in a capitalist system, and basically what we need to rethink the way that we produce and consume. What that would entail, I mean, I really am not in a position to say. Like I am not unfortunately, I'm not that sort of a visionary. But historically, the times that people have tried, it didn't work so well. Okay, I mean, we have to also reckon with that. So there are obviously businesses who do a better job, who go kind of beyond greenwashing, and sort of these statements about, you know, we are you know, anti-racist and you know, environmentally friendly, but nonetheless they're all trying to make a profit. They're selling us stuff, right? The whole point is to produce things that will become obsolete so that you have to replace them. That's how the system works. And so there is no business that can function without making a profit in this system. So it's not about morals, it's about structure. And so it's not really that a business is bad. I mean, they're operating in the way that they're supposed to operate. This is very similar to the police. The police is designed for a particular function, and reforming the police isn't going to, you know, make a difference. It's just going to make them better at what they already do. And so the same thing happens with capitalism, with businesses, if they are now, you know, implementing better. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't. Please don't get me wrong. Like, you know, it's what we got right now. But if they implement better labor laws, if they have environmental protection and things like that, it makes them more sustainable in a world where capitalism has to reckon with the climate emergency. So businesses that realize this will profit more, meaning that, you know, this similarly to how we recycle so that we feel good about ourselves, right? Not because, I mean, it's all landing in the landfill right now anyway, because China is not accepting any of our plastics anymore. So it's just a mechanism to make us feel like we're doing our part. And this happens on on different scales. Companies do the same thing. And ultimately that makes them more profitable, more sustainable in this world. People who are conscious like us, they will prefer to buy from a company that is, you know, not exploiting its labor force, that is recognizing that pollution is a terrible thing and that they need to, you know, deal with their externalities and what have you. Yes, but that's moral, sure, but it's also maintaining the system that we're criticizing here.
So if I can briefly respond to that, I'm a newly appointed professor at Wharton. There's certainly a diverse set of views at Wharton, so certainly it's a shame that that particular professor said that, but I work in particular on environmental and energy issues in low-income communities, and so I would have a very different answer than what that professor said, and I'm happy to chat more with folks if people are interested.
Thank you.
What kind of classes do you teach?
Currently, I'm teaching Introduction to Microeconomics for MBA students, and trying to incorporate some of this material also, rather than just profit maximizing, thinking about social impact and thinking about this a little bit more critically. But granted, still within, you know, the economics framework. So there's, yeah.
I would like to respond to the one question about, really, it's a plea almost, you know, about panic. Like, sorry, this is all severely panic-inducing. How do you see us moving forward? Are these issues solvable? What is the right way to fight them? And we actually had a discussion yesterday in a panel on, you know, mental health and climate that sort of tried to get to the core of this. And I realize how profoundly unsettling this is. And I don't think that there is a solution or a fix in the way that we tend to imagine solutions or fixes. But that is in and of itself not that threatening. If you are able to kind of abolish the sort of fix in your head, the notion of the fix, that everything that is difficult needs to be fixed. That's not how the world works. It never has. And their history really is a very, very good guide. People have lived through horrendous things, right? And I'm not trying to idealize or romanticize this, but it's been a reality of human existence ever since humans walked the face of the planet, right? So the notion that life is always getting better, that life is always improving and getting more just, is something that is very recent, is very modern, that didn't exist before the middle of the 19th century. And so in that sense, I think history is a really good guide and can give us some, you know, strategies, both for coping as individuals and also as societies to sort of deal with the pressures that are coming and that are not going to go away. It is, in my view, kind of almost irresponsible to clamor for a fix, because that diverts attention from the kinds of things that we really need to be doing, taking care of us, building connections with people in our communities, making sure that, you know, we on a daily basis kind of help working towards solutions that is making life dignified or maintaining a dignity of life for people and expanding that dignity. And that means, you know, we will have to give up certain things. And if we realize this and are willing to, it's going to be much easier than if the proverbial shit hits the fan and the stuff is taken from us, whether by a hurricane or a fire. I mean, we talked about this yesterday in my class, right? I mean, we worry about people smashing windows and taking sneakers, right? But we don't worry, we don't hold accountable the corporations and organizations and states that are responsible for the climate emergency, that is now responsible for the fires that are taking the homes and businesses of people in Oregon and California. There is no restitution, there are no reparations, and none of that is happening. And so those kinds of things we could think about. There are solutions that are not going to fix the problem, but if we think about the few individuals that have accumulated, even during the pandemic, astronomical wealth. Like Bezos' wealth could almost end world hunger. I mean, if you think about that, there are clearly solutions that could be possible. But that's where I think the white nationalist and story is really important. And it's kind of interesting to me that, particularly in places like the United States, where this history is so ingrained, I mean, we have a white supremacist system, you know, that's the root, is at the root of what the United States is. And so white people are so invested in the day that they're going to be rich, rather than sort of understand that they have a lot more in common. Poor white people, or, you know, lower class white people, have a lot more in common with poor people of color and poor Black people than they have with someone like Donald Trump or Jeff Bezos. But nonetheless, their sense of their superiority is rested in the imagination that they somehow better, or more important, than freer, really, than the people against which their identity is defined. And so that is a major impediment to thinking creatively about different kinds of solutions. And that's why I think these issues need to be discussed in tandem.
there are a few questions we missed. As environmentalism is monopolized by white voices and disproportionately affects people of color, what would you say about the white savior complex within the climate movement?
Oh God, yeah, I know. It's really quite annoying. I think there I would really say, like, what we're seeing right now should also apply to environmentalism, right? This movement should be led by young people. It should be led by Black people. It should be led by people of color. This is not something that, you know, people with university degrees and cultural capital should put themselves at the helm of. It's time. I mean, I'm saying this right now as I've been blabbering on, right? But it's time for people like me to shut up.
I don't know. I disagree.
I mean, not in a context like this, but, you know, I mean, to sort of assume a leadership position, I think is really not that feeds the sort of savior complex, like, you know, and it's really not about whether or not I feel good about myself. And it shouldn't be. It should be. I mean, to be honest about this. I mean, yes, of course, it helps to feel like you're doing a good thing, right? But it does for all of us. But at the same time, I mean, the sort of selfishness of, you know, of a lot of white people who then kind of try to put themselves at the forefront because they need to feel like they're doing something is often really detracting and counterproductive to what's organically happened at the grassroots. And I think that is something that, you know, sometimes taking a step back and being on the sidelines and being an ally or a supporter or an accomplice is more important than rising to a position of a leader.
Mm-hmm. So it's we have two questions that we missed that are connected in some way to each other. Do you think that white nationalism has had a significant effect on our energy policy? Do you think it has encouraged our continued use of fossil fuels? And then Macy's question at the end, the neoliberal economic project and persistent market fundamentalism has inherently created worsened systemic racism and the climate crisis. Is social democratic policy like the Green New Deal enough to address the crisis, or would it just serve as a revival of capitalism as some perceived the original New Deal to have been? Oh, complicated.
Yes, very complicated. I would agree with that sentiment. So let me tackle the first part first. So the connection between energy politics and white nationalism and white supremacy. I think that Timothy Mitchell's Carbon Democracy makes it very clear that even our understanding of, you know, progress and democracy is sort of wedded to petrocapitalism. It was made possible by an expansion of energy and resources that really could power this progress that we've seen kind of taking off in the middle of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century. So both democracy and the sort of ideas and ideologies that I'm sympathetic to, as well as white nationalism, is powered by petrocapitalism. So I wouldn't say that progressives aren't equally indebted to fossil fuels. The way of life, the way of thinking, the way of operating in the world is based on excess energy, access to excess energy. That is the only way that we kind of get to the standard of living, that we can be on Zoom during a pandemic, that we can extend life expectancy and all those things. So it's not fair to say that this is only something that connects to white nationalists. This is the fuel that is making the world work the way that it is right now, both for progressives and anyone else. And so, yes, I think neoliberal economic projects obviously are very, very explicitly reproducing the sort of imperialist, extractivist policies under a different guise, that now it's not states that are invading places and, you know, colonizing populations and taking their resources and their labor, but it's corporations that do so in the name of, you know, even in the name of reducing carbon footprints or or what have you, like clean energy mechanisms. I mean, that's the problem with a systemic understanding of the world. The systems are designed to reproduce themselves. And so it's really, really difficult to think about a way to step out of the system. And even if people will say, well, a revolution is going to do this, that's not the case and has not been the case in the past. Even massive upheavals like the Russian Revolution ended up reproducing the system in a different fashion. So I wish like historically there hasn't been a solution. There's only been a gradual transformation in the modern age of white supremacy, but not there has been no movement that has upended it. Maybe we'll do it now. I don't know.
So, no, because I mean the question is how should we proceed about our future? Yeah, how as we are converting to more towards more sustainable energy sources, and how do we do it in this inclusive way? That
I mean the models that historians have sort of looked to, like Julia Adler Thomas, who has talked about pre-modern Japan and kind of stressed the sort of resilience that you see in pre-modern societies that are obviously not flying across the globe, traveling, having the sort of lifestyle that we would want, but it's also a model that doesn't see balls and destruction and race war and what have you. So I mean it's really difficult for me to sort of project like what could be an alternative, because that would assume that we could agree on an alternative. And even if we were to agree in theory to dismantle these systems is really not something that happens by decision or by decree or by executive order. I mean, this gets us into really the sort of complex functioning of at the level of at a systemic level of how interconnected these things are, that I am as a historian not in a position to imagine how. I simply can't. I lack the imagination to do that. I really do. I apologize, but I don't have the imagination to actually see how we could reassemble.
Maybe you can comment on your perception of the Green New Deal, right? Like how
I mean, that's
how does it?
It's kind of like I like the comparison to FDR. It was really radical at the time, but it was also inspired, I think, and Wolfgang Schäuble-Busch has made that argument explicitly. It was also inspired by by what FDR saw happening in Russia and in Nazi Germany and to some extent Italy. It was in those states where the depression simply seemed to disappear, because they invested in, in German case in armaments, in the Russian case in, industrialization. But basically they put money into the economy, and FDR did something quite similar. Here, even, without the clenching down on civil liberties, obviously, but the sort of notion that the depression somehow wasn't felt so much in these other states inspired the original New Deal, at least in part. And I think the Green New Deal is perhaps the best possible alternative that we have at this point. To say, okay, well, clearly I can't even imagine how we would reinvent the system, or I would have to think about this a lot more, not like on the spot like this. But the Green New Deal, I think, is providing a bunch of entry points where we could start reimagining how parts of the system function. And so that was the case with the original deal, also New Deal, also in terms of thinking about the economy in different terms. I mean, the sort of model of the economy that can be managed is something, I mean, that we see being adopted by Western liberal, in the sense of free market liberal democracies for the first time, that the market needs to be regulated. We still pretend it doesn't, but in our rhetoric, but the New Deal demonstrated that actually we kind of changed our view on that, and have since managed the economy in various ways. And I think the Green New Deal is making that explicit, and in ways that is promising, I think. Even though I don't think it's going to, upend or be a solution for all of the problems that I have sort of flagged right now.
Another question that we missed: the exportation of Western, particularly American plastic recyclables to lower income nations has received criticism in recent years, and outright importation bans from some countries due to environmental impacts. How does white nationalism play into this issue, and how does it impact potential solutions? Oh, and then of course you study waste also, right? So
yeah,
also connected to this question. How should we think of the connections there?
So plastics are really terrible. They're really, really terrible. In that the molecules of plastics, especially the sort of soft plastics that are so fantastic, right? That we have in our clothes and in plastic bottles, the malleable plastics, the chemicals that make them such, that give them nice shiny colors and shapes and forms that we can adapt, and that we can melt them in and recycle them. It's these chemicals, they're not actually like really bound, they're sort of sitting in the plastics, and they off gas and leach out, and they are the ones that attach to other toxins and amplify across the food chain as they enter the food supply. And as I said before, they act like estrogens in the body, and obviously when toxins attach to microplastic particles, which they do, they also amplify. So plastics really are vehicles for all sorts of other environmental hazards. And because they break down rather than biodegrade, they basically just break into tiny, tiny, tiny particles. They enter the food supply in a massive form, right? I mean, we have now, every beach is full of plastic, and not just visible, like the sand kernels, actually a very large component of them are actually plastic. Plastic is in the ocean, plastic is in our water supply, plastic is in everything that we consume. And so obviously by exporting our waste, we are basically just getting rid of the problem, rather than if we would have, I mean, I've actually suggested this, that waste is the sort of thing that makes the system realize that it is broken. If waste spills into the streets, if we have a garbage crisis, I mean, that's what happened in the 1960s. The sanitation workers went on strike. And the cities were festering with garbage. I mean, people were talking about super rats and stuff like you've seen the Joker, right? That is the garbage crisis in New York in the 80s. But it is in those moments when the system has to grapple with its own kind of breaking point. And so waste management really is key to the system's ability to reproduce itself, because the substances that are toxic, that are unwanted, that are dangerous and hazardous need to be removed in order for us to feel like like life goes on as normal. And the mechanisms of removal usually are hidden and invisible to most people. And we're not aware that they're even happening, because we are taking our garbage and dumping it in the trash. But each American has control only over about 100 tons of garbage over the course of their lifespan, which seems astronomical, right? But that's just the stuff that you take to the curb yourself. Overall, the waste that is produced on each and every one of our behalf is 2,700 tons of all the stuff that somehow falls off in the production process. Our 100 tons is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that. 2,700 tons is emitted, flushed, and dumped on each and every one of our behalves over the course of our lifespan as an average American. And so obviously, if those 2.7 thousand tons for everyone would accumulate in the spaces that we live and work, we couldn't function. And so clearly, by removing the waste to places that do not have the ability to resist this practice of dumping our waste there, whether they're is, you know, is the way that we've done it now for quite some time. And obviously it is affecting these communities dramatically in two ways. And there's also not a clear answer to this, because for a lot of, you know, entrepreneurs in the global South, waste actually is really profitable. Even in our own country, recycling is so much more profitable than dumping. And so these kinds of dynamics, again, are linked to a capitalist system that, you know, there is a way in which someone can make a profit out of it, and that comes with costs. And those costs are generally borne by those who don't have the ability to defend themselves against the harm.
Why is recycling more profitable than dumping?
Because it has plants and labor forces, and it actually, you know, requires the technology and investments. So it's a hugely profitable industry that then is able to sell the end product.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When there is no buyer, on the other hand, then recycling is not profitable, and that's what we're seeing in the US right now. So that's why, you know, the MRFs, which are material recovery facilities, are continuing to operate, but they end up dumping most of the recyclables in landfills because there's no market. Because China is no longer buying plastic. There are other countries who are closing doors to American waste products that could be recycled. But for example, paper and metal can really be very well recycled. It requires a lot of water and a lot of other resources, but it is a huge industry.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this opens the door. I see that you're working on a book, right, about waste and Nazi Germany. What is the connection and the main thread there? I mean, it's a whole new topic. This is the end. But just
you have all seen the images of piles of shoes, piles of rags. What do you think that is? Those are recyclables. The Nazi regime, moreover, instrumentalized the extraction of labor, because the concentration camps, not the death camps primarily, not the death camps, but the concentration camps inside Germany actually were the main sites where recyclables were refashioned, where slave labor was washing, sorting through rags, and refurbishing broken down machinery and what have you. So at the same time that the regime, you know, produces a language and rhetoric about cleanliness and health and sanitation in ways that is intimately connected to the removal of unwanted people and substances. And then we see this kind of taking off really in the concentration camp complex. But it's extended throughout the body politic. I mean, people are demonstrating what good Nazis they are because they separate their household waste. So, I mean, that's a whole other topic really, but it demonstrates that some of the mechanisms with which we, you know, deal with the systemic problems like waste or, you know, the climate crisis, they're not implicitly ideological in one way or another. So recycling can be used by very progressive, you know, left-leaning individuals, but it can also serve a genocidal regime. So I think it's really important to kind of understand that there's nothing inherently good or bad about recycling or waste management or, you know, the distribution of various kinds of other
No, because I mean, this is just, everything is connected, right? Because now we have, especially in times of COVID, right? We have, we know the New Yorkers as just a specific example, right? They're flying the flight of New Yorkers to the nice suburbs, right? Where there's waste removal, there's space, cleanliness, and so forth, right? And there's certain
no looters. Yes, exactly.
There's certain social classes that can do that, but right, as opposed to the dirty right, inner city and so forth. So it's kind of interesting to see how the dynamics of COVID and the strangeness of the time we live in comes into this, right? Cleanliness and better.
And COVID also, increases our plastic production dramatically, our plastic consumption, because we all wear gloves, we all have face shields, we have masks. Hospitals are kind of shrink wrapped, really. So I mean, those kinds of connections. Yeah, I mean, it's really, right now we are living in a moment of rapid acceleration.
Of waste, you're saying?
Of cascading, intersecting crises.
Of cascading, intersecting crises. Yeah. But overall, it's just probably, I should study this because I haven't researched this enough, but there must be, right, the footprint of somebody living in those, in the suburbs and with a lot more space. And from the little I know, right, the carbon footprint of somebody like that versus people who lived in a more densely packed inner city, right, is much larger. So
I mean, I'm not 100% sure. I think it depends a lot on lifestyle also, right? I mean, how much do you use your air conditioning? How much do you, how large is your house? Like you can have a mansion in the inner city that is using just as much energy as, one of those plastic boxes in the suburbs.
I make statements like that. Correct. It's not the.
I think that's more complicated, but overall, in average terms, probably yes.
I see. Okay. Any other last questions here? I mean, this is so interesting. I was also going to ask perhaps for a reading list. May I pick and skim through your class syllabus to get some readings?
I can also give you like a docu dump if you want, and just kind of put those readings in a box folder, and you can share with your students.
Oh, that would be wonderful. That would be super, super, super interesting. So just to announce it before we go, you have the, sorry, what is the event that you mentioned that's also going on?
Tomorrow, it's basically from Earth Day to Climate Week. It's a discussion with activists, both from the first Earth Day, and with members of Police Free Penn and Fossil Free Penn, and two of the students who were doing the work in my class last semester, kind of unpacking the history of Earth Day at Penn and sort of pointing to some of the sort of contradictions that shaped the environmental movement in the 70s.
That's super interesting.
That is from 5 to 7 tomorrow.
Okay, excellent. And I was just going to advertise in the Earth and Environmental Science department as part of Earth Day. We have a local prof in our department who's going to talk about climate change science impacts and opportunities. He comes from a sustainability industry background, which is interesting because he's different from most of us who are academics. So he can give a perspective of what it is to work in sustainability and to work towards reducing climate change impacts coming from the industry. So that's Friday at 3 to 4 p.m. So I will try to go to as many of the events as possible. And thank you for the many comments. I will keep some of these questions for thinking about these. It's quite interesting. I mean, this week we have you as a guest, and then we will continue on Thursday with the students in class on talking about climate skepticism.
Okay.
And trying to see kind of where. So this is perfect for us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really want to thank everyone for their questions and for listening to me rant. I apologize if I was
to take your classes. We all want to take your classes. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
We have somebody from University of Mauritius.
Wow.
Okay. Now, I don't even know how to spell it. Mauritius. Yeah, it's amazing. Some people from all over the place. So this has been recorded. I will stop now.